Thank you very much, Yvonne. And Madam Rebecca Greenspan, welcome to Kenya. It was a great pleasure meeting you in Geneva, and I did promise, and I wanted to keep the promise, that I would welcome you to Kenya, and we would have an interaction between you, the officials of the government of Kenya, on the very primary and important issues that speak to our situation today in Kenya, in our region, and of course, globally. The balance between the 1.4 billion people market in Africa and the rest of the globe. Let me speak to ACFTA first. As you've said correctly, Yvonne, we're already in a very pivotal situation, and this was said by my good brother, the representative of the UN here, that we have the advantage of location, being a country in the East Coast with a port in Mombasa. So we are, to a good extent, a logistical hub, both for our region and continentally. Number two, we are also a financial hub. We have some of the best financial institutions, banks and international financial institutions headquartered here for our region. And it is the reason why we already have a very thriving trade and business environment between us and our partners, both in EAC, in COMESA as well, where we are members. EAC is among the most progressive interaction economic blocks in Africa. I think our intra-Africa trade, our intra-EAC trade is now, I think, 19-20%, while the intra-Africa trade, in Africa is down to 13-14. So we're already in that space. And it is also the reason why when I came into office and appointed a very effective Minister for Trade, Moses there, he's traveled to 20 countries in Africa on the subject of integration. And it is because we believe it's time for us to put all the blocks together. The reason why we've been pushing hard, the reason why I was in Mozambique 4 or 5 days ago, is because we want to conclude the tripartite free trade area agreement that brings together EAC, COMESA, and SADC. That will give us 720 million people market. And it is the building block into the Africa Continental Free Trade Area. While that is the case, our biggest trading partners today in our, as Kenya, is our regional partners, Uganda, Tanzania, Rwanda, Burundi, DRC. That's where our biggest market is. And therefore, we are already speaking to the Africa Continental Free Trade Area ecosystem. Intra-Africa trade is already where our biggest market is. And therefore, what UNCTAD is doing, providing us information, giving us leverage on where our trade should go, is significant. And that is why I really wanted to be part of this conversation. And as we do that, we also realize that our continent contributes only 3% to international trade. So it means, as we build our continent's network and integration to trade amongst ourselves, we also must have at the back of our minds, how do we meaningfully also contribute to international trade? How does intra-African trade also speak the language of international trade. And that is why it's also important for us to build the linkages we are building with EU, for example. We have a signed agreement now with EU. It should have been an agreement for EAC. We went ahead as Kenya because we were ready, but we are confident that our East African community friends will come along. We hope it will be extended to the tripartite free trade area and eventually to the continental framework. It is the reason why today we are negotiating with the US on a strategic partnership agreement. It is the reason why we are negotiating with other blocs, because ultimately Africa must contribute its fair share. 3% is not where we should be. At the very minimum, we should be in the realm of our percentage of population, maybe 17, maybe 20% of global trade. And we are also focusing on the real opportunity that we have in the future. This continent is going to be home to a quarter of the world's population by 2050. This is the continent that has renewable energy resources. This is the continent that has 2/3 of the world's arable uncultivated land. This is the youngest continent. So we have real assets that has the potential to make Africa central to what happens globally going into the future. And that is why integration is front and center, left and right, in us going forward.
That's right, Mr. President. And nothing signified this more than the COVID-19 pandemic that disrupted the global supply chain system and made African nations start to look inward as to, like the President says, our contribution to the global trade. And so with that, Ms. Greenspan, what do you see as a potential for AFCTA and how, African countries can leverage that to access the global supply chain system and perhaps contribute even greater to it, as the President has said? There it is.
Thank you. First of all, let me really thank the President first for being here with us. And I know that you have had very intensive days. And so it means a lot for you to be here and for you to have this dialogue with us. So thank you so much, President. But also thank you for your voice, not only for Kenya, but for the African continent and for the developing countries, because we need strong voices really to put out there in the international community the needs and the vision that is coming from the Global South. So thank you so much. And I like also the approach that you do this, talking about our common objectives as a global society, not only in the divisional way of putting things, but also in how constructive we can build together a better world if we really follow the objectives that we have set for ourselves, the SDGs and the climate change and Paris Agreement. So really thank you very much for that. With respect to the African Continental Free Trade Area, in UNCTAD, we have been very strong advocates for the integration of the continent. And I have always said that coming from Latin America, I feel envious of the dynamism that you see, 54 countries signing the agreement, 46 countries already, if I am not mistaken, have ratified it. And now you're saying also, Mr. President, of the sub-regional systems and communities coming together to converge, because the convergence is a first step for building the African free trade area. And we have estimated, more or less, that if tariff liberalization will bring around 9.2 billion more per year for the African continent. But if we face and solve also the challenges of non-tariff measures that are even more of an obstacle in many senses than tariffs themselves. And if we can really invest in the infrastructure and logistics that the continent needs, that number of 9.2 billion will get to 22 billion at least per year for the African continent. And that will give, as the President said, the scale for private investment, because many times when we go to the private sector and the investment community, they tell us, but we have to go country by country, for making an investment that can be an investment for the whole continent, but we have different norms, different rules, different policies in each country, so it doesn't make sense for us because it doesn't have the scale. But if the continental free trade area came as an agreement, or the convergence of the sub-regional systems, as the President said, come together and can harmonize all those rules and barriers that the private sector finds, so investment can really scale up in a major way in the continent. And I agree with you, President. Africa has all what the world needs for the future, for the green transition, for the energy transition. The minerals are here. They are nowhere else. For the future of the world, the young people is here. It will be in Africa. So the talent, the innovation, the energy, the market also will be in Africa. So, and I really feel, when I come to this continent, I feel like the energy that is building up here. Yes, I really feel a change, of everything, of leadership, of ambition, of enthusiasm that is needed to look at the future with hope. Yes. Now, challenges are there. We need the logistics. Yes. When we made our report about the African free trade area, we found that the logistic and infrastructure, for example, of the ports, yes, is built more for the trade outside Africa with the partners outside Africa than inside Africa. So the connectivity inside Africa will have to be built with a different perspective. Yes, the perspective before was to export final goods or raw materials to the rest of the world. Now that is, also for the continent, we will have to build the necessary connectivity for that to happen. The regulations, as we said, the harmonization of the rules, the digital market for Africa. Kenya, that is really a leading force here, in finance and in private sector development, really is a very good voice and has been a very good model in terms of what can be achieved in fintech. I was amazed, President, let me say. I was in the Masai Mara with my family, and everything went through M-Pesa. All the payments, it was immediate, it was fast, it was, and many times not even in Switzerland I am able to do that. So, especially for very small business, yes, it was the Maasai that were using it. It wasn't a sophisticated business or a sophisticated store. And that's really inclusive finance, is really an important thing for the wide-based economy. My only point here, to be frank, is that we have to learn how not to fall in the mistakes of the past, because the raw materials were here before and the value added was not done for going up the ladder in the technological sophistication and the complexity of goods. Trade has to be also of intermediate goods, not only of final goods. because to be able to build the global value chains and participate, like the president said, in the global economy in a different foot, you have to develop the global value chains also inside the continent. Add value, invest in the human capital that you need because you already have a good base for that, technology access, and President, financing for the small and medium enterprises, but also for the countries that need the investment to be able to do the transition and to invest in the sectors that are possible for that vision to be true.
And thank you, Ms. Greenspan, for taking us into the financial sector. Obviously, for our involvement in the global economy, finance is an important one. Mr. President, you have been a champion for a reform of the global architectural financial system, and you've advocated for this at various international fora, the UN General Assembly, COP27, amongst others. So speak to us about this agenda, why it is important to you, and how you think it'll benefit Kenya and Africa.
Of course, everybody likes money. But this goes beyond money. Let me give you an example. When we did, for the first time, when we looked at how do we begin to roll out the mechanisms that would make Africa Continental Free Trade Area a reality. We decided to export tea to Ghana. That tea took 6 weeks to get to Ghana because it had to go east first towards Dubai and then back, That journey ordinarily would have taken, even if it was by road from Nairobi, it should have taken maybe a week, maybe 7 days, maybe 6 days. So logistics is an issue, as was said by Secretary General here. And with logistics comes, how do you put logistics in place? We all know that even traveling, even by air in this continent, is very, very, very difficult and very expensive. Sometimes you have to go to Europe before you come to some other place. So logistics and the infrastructure to make sure that we can move goods, we can move services from one corner to the other. There you speak to financing. How do we finance the infrastructure necessary to unlock the potential of trade between our countries? And finance becomes very central, and three things are very important when you speak about finance. Number one is cost. Number two is scale. Number three is how long it takes to get it. At the moment, and I'm speaking as a policymaker, and I'm speaking as somebody who has interacted in this space, it takes eternity, if I may say. It takes eternity to get to any financial close on many aspects when you're looking for financing, number one. Number two, sometimes you don't get the scale of the money you're looking for. And number three, there is something called risk, which is a new definition of how not to lend money. Because this risk, and and we pay an arm and a leg for risk. Although data speaks a different language, data shows that investments in our region are not as risky as they are being profiled. So in fact, this profiling of our region as a risky destination is a conspiracy by people. And I saw some of them about a week ago, 2 weeks ago. They were trying to profile us, the credit rating agencies. I think they are the new tools of colonialism, if I may say. Because data speak a different language from the risk we are being profiled. And as a result, we are all now in this space, and it's almost a consensus that the people, the rest of us in this region, we pay anywhere between 4 and 8 times more for resources, for development, for investment, put in place infrastructure than others, than our brothers and sisters in the global north. And we have no problem with our brothers and sisters in the global north accessing finances lower than us. The question we are asking ourselves is that why are we not getting the same treatment? Why are we being profiled negatively when facts and data show something different? So this is the conversation we want to have. And it is a foregone conclusion today that the system we have is not working. It is not working. It can do better. And that's why we are saying there is need for reform of the international financial system to do 3 things. Reform to speak to time. How long does it take? It takes minimum 18, 24 months. You know, some of the interventions don't have that kind of gestation period. It doesn't have that time of time, number one. Number two, scale. I'm speaking, for example, and I'm asking myself, if we were to ask for $3 billion to build the standard gauge railway, which China was gracious to give to us, and it took a fairly short time, below 12 months. We wouldn't have built the SGR if we were looking for finances in the current financial system. We wouldn't get that scale. And number 3, we wouldn't get the kind of interest that we are looking for. So our position is that there is something the current international financial institutions can do from China, for example, scale and speed. Maybe there is something China can also learn from our current international institution. But we are saying there needs to be a conversation. We need a conversation that makes all of us winners. And what we are saying is, in the reform of these institutions, we're not being reckless. What we are saying is, let us have a fairer international financial system that doesn't price the rest of us into debt, into default, into a situation where it becomes impossible. I mean, let me just ask us seated here. If one person is paying 8 times more than the other, isn't that person paying 8 times set up to fail from the beginning? In fact, it would be a miracle if you don't default. In fact, I think some people are asking themselves, why have these people not defaulted? And it is the same reason, for example, why those Moody's people, the credit rating agencies, were really pushing that, Kenya is in very serious situation. Until we told them, if you continue profiling us negatively, we will pay off this debt and see what you're going to do. Because they were making it look like we are unable to pay. We're telling them, we want to pay. In fact, we want to pay before it's due. And they wanted to tell us, if you pay before it's due, it amounts to a default. What kind of nonsense is that? I mean, if you pay your debt early, how does it become a default? It's madness, isn't it? But, we are not conforming to what their expectations. So they are wondering, you are paying 8% more. Why are you not defaulting? Why do you want to pay early? this is the unfortunate conversation we want to have. And that's why, just to conclude, we're saying we want a fairer system that doesn't mistreat other people. We want a fairer system that we pay whatever others are paying. And good people, asking for a fairer system, saying that we want to pay the same interest others are paying, is not asking for too much. It is not breaking the system. It is not unreasonable. I mean, by all accounts, it cannot be unreasonable. We're all saying, let's pay what others are paying. And let's get the scale that can help us achieve what we want. And let us accelerate so that we can all move at the same pace. So that is the push. It is the position of many leaders in the global south. This is not a conversation of North versus South. No, it is a conversation of fairness. And we are not saying the global North should pay more than us. No, we are saying let's pay the same. Tell me how that is not a good thing.
And that's right. And Ms. Greenspan, you also alluded to this earlier this morning during the launch of the Economic Development Africa report for this year. Perhaps you could speak a little more to that here as well. And even as you do that, then you could also speak about some other constraints you think are holding Africa behind and what needs to be done about them.
Yes, thank you very much. I have very little to add after what the President said. As you know, the Secretary General has been an important voice in that direction, also hearing, the voices like President Ruto. And there has been a policy brief that has been issued by the Secretary General with the very concrete proposals for the reform of the international financial system. Having said that, I think, like you said, President, that in a way, when the system was established after the Second World War, the system was established to prevent the contagion of one country getting into trouble and making a contagious, a wave on the others. And in a way, the system is built country by country. Yes? It has not many instruments for systemic shocks. And what has happened during these last years is that what we have witnessed and suffered is systemic shocks. Climate change is a systemic shock and is really hitting hard the most vulnerable countries. And here I've heard you saying, President, how much livestock Kenya have lost because of the drought that has really gone in the Horn of Africa. And climate change is a systemic shock for development. And in a way, we are trying right now to calculate how much of the debt of many countries come because of the impact of climate change.
Absolutely.
That is not because you took a bad decision, it's just that you were hit by the climate change problem. The second shock was COVID-19. Yes, it is not of the doing of anybody in particular. It's not because of bad behavior of one country. It was a global shock. And in fact, I really think that the developing countries used every fiscal space they had to try to answer to the needs that arise because of COVID-19 in the population. And then when we thought that we were going to go into a recovery year, conflict and war hit the world again. And in a way, it was also a systemic shock. Prices of energy and food really went up, and in a dramatic way. And at the same time, because it triggered the inflation problem in the most developed world, so interest rates started to go up and hitting again the finances of the developing countries, because devaluation hit you twice, yes? Prices of food were going up, prices of energy were going up, and because of the devaluation of the currency and the strength of the dollar, then domestic prices continue to go up. So the question also is, do we have the international financial system needed really to face the global shocks in a more effective and efficient way for all of us? So one good thing that happened during COVID is that the SDRs were issued. There was an emission of SDRs. That is one of the few instruments that we have at hand, and that has to be welcomed. But we know that the SDRs are distributed according to the quotas of the countries in the International Monetary Fund. So from the $650 billion that were issued in FDRs, Africa received 33 billion. So a continent of 1.2 billion people received $33 billion in SDRs. Germany, with 83 million people, received the same. So there is something in the initial inbuilding of the system that didn't consider the situation that we are living through today, because the system was thought in a different moment. So I think that the call for an international reform of the international system has to be seen as a possibility to strengthen multilateral action, not to weaken it, because we need the system. We need a multilateral system. We need a multilateral financial system. We need the institutions that we build with so much effort. But the institutions have to be able to change. And I think that that is the voice that we are hearing. It has to change to really face a fairer aspiration in terms of the distribution of the resources, but it's also needed to scale up, the investment that the countries need. Let me give you one indicator. The World Bank today is 20% only of what the World Bank was in the 60s with respect to the global economy. The global economy has grown much more, but the World Bank has not grown to the pace of the international economy. So in a way, we also have a small system with respect to the needs that we have today. And that's what we have called, why we have called for the recapitalization of the multilateral development banks, and we have called also for a different model that will answer to what the President said. We need long-term speed and scale and cost, that the President said, in the multilateral development system to leverage private investment, to face the risk perception. We need much more, and unfortunately, we have a system that is constrained today by some of the norms that we decided to have in 1945.
That's right, and yes, I know that's... And, Ms. Greenspan, you've talked about the shocks that we have faced globally, and one of those is climate change. Mr. President, leading the country through the worst drought in 40 years, not just in Kenya, but in the Horn of Africa in general. And on the climate change agenda, you've been clearly advocating for particular matters like loss and damage. So talk to us about reconciling Africa's development needs and the climate action agenda. Even as the continent continues with its quest towards industrialization, there is the negative effects of climate change. So talk to us about how you reconcile both needs, the climate change agenda and development of the continent and Kenya.
I think there has been a debate as to whether you can talk about a green growth, development, climate change in the same sentence. I mean, there's been a belief somehow that green energy is not sufficient, doesn't have the scale, doesn't have the cost that can drive industrialization or real development. I think the narrative is changing. In fact, the reality is that it is no longer possible to talk about development without talking about climate change. Because climate change is having a huge impact on any meaningful development. In fact, many countries, as was said very ably by Secretary General here, many countries are funding with their huge budgets the effects of climate change. And you have two situations. She said it so well. Two situations. Situation number one, you have a situation where because of this profile of risk, you're paying much more than others. You have another situation of effects of climate change, which you never benefited from. You didn't get the industrialization that came with the exploitation of fossil fuels. So you're stuck with a situation where you are paying huge interest rates in an underdeveloped system, and you torn in between, you don't know where to stand. So what we should be, my focus, and that is why we are having the Africa Climate Summit, where we want to consolidate our thoughts, our ideas, and what we think the solution to where we are, the challenge that we are of development versus climate change, what we think as a continent should be the way forward on the 4th and 6th of next month. And I welcome all of you to come to the summit so that you can bring these very good ideas and we can consolidate them together. Because of the inevitable, and it's now a confirmed reality that Africa is home to the largest reserves of green energy. Africa is also home to the minerals, actually almost 40–45% of all the minerals required for green transition. And therefore, with that kind of situation, green growth will be most viable in this continent. And development around industrialization, around manufacturing, will now make a lot of sense where you have the largest reservoirs of green energy, and that is in this continent. And therefore, going into the future, green growth, green industrialization, green manufacturing, the genuine natural home will be in Africa. And that is why we are pitching that if the reality is, and I think we all now agree that it is not an option anymore unless we do not want to have a home for all of us. If we continue the fossil fuel trajectory, we will burn this home, this earth. And it will burn for everybody. It will not burn for the global south and leave the global north, or burn for the global north and leave the global south. We are on this together. So we better act together. And that is why we have taken the position that we do not want the old narrative of finger pointing. We want to solve this problem together. The global south and the global north together. How are we going to do it together? We have renewable assets. We have green energy. We have green minerals. We can provide green industrialization. What we don't have in abundance is financing and technology. We can have a win-win outcome if we bring global south green energy resources, global south green energy, global south green minerals, and we bring global north technology and global north financing. We will come out with a win-win solution instead of the endless quarrel between the north and the south. That is the proposal we intend to bring. And we do not want to come to the table with a blame game situation. We want to come to the table with solutions. And we will be proposing how Africa can leverage on its assets. Number 1, of green energy. Number 2, of green minerals. Number 3, of our human capital, the youngest continent in the world. Number 3, of smart agriculture and unlocking the potential of the 2/3 uncultivated and arable land in our continent. How do we bring these assets to the table? To do 2 things, to provide green growth, to provide jobs, and to decarbonize the rest of the globe. We can make a very significant contribution as a continent using the assets that we have in solving the global problem of climate change that is coming as a result of the exploitation of fossil fuels. So I think we really have a win-win possibility. And we can do this together. So this is what I imagine that to be. And we will be having that conversation. We are willing to listen to others. We are willing to bring our ideas on the table. What we have refused is that we shall not be a continent anymore of victims. We will not come to any table just as victims of climate change. We are coming to the table with ideas and possibilities of solutions on what we can contribute, because Africa can make a contribution to the global solution, the global challenge, and provide solutions to the global problem that we have. And we want to be seen in that new approach to the issues around the global challenges we have. And I did say, for example, we need to look at alternative sources of funding. We appreciate that there are limitations, as was said by my sister Greenspan here. There are limitations of the current financial institution. There are limitations with the World Bank. There are limitations with the IMF. There are limitations with multilateral banks. And we are not accusing them of anything. There are limitations, genuine. Maybe they are 20%, as has been said, of what they were. Maybe the magnitude of the financial challenge that we have as a globe goes beyond these institutions. How do we develop other capacities? How do we raise more resources? And that is why the conversation about carbon tax is no longer a sterile. It's no longer a sterile proposition. It is a real proposition. How do we raise resources that can be used in a different paradigm without the current limitations, where we invest these resources in the biggest return on matters to do with green growth? How do we decarbonize the globe together If the best opportunities are in Africa, let us invest in Africa. If the best opportunities are elsewhere to decarbonize our development, let us invest in that elsewhere. We are ready to have that conversation. And I said that we do not want to be left out of the equation. We want countries in 1945. We didn't exist in 1945. Today we exist. And we don't want to be pushed into the corner. We want to be seated here and making a contribution. If it is carbon tax, if it is on aviation, we want to pay our portion. If it is on marine movement, we want to pay our portion. We want to pay our portion. We don't want to be joyriders. We don't want to be bystanders. We don't want to be in some corner, because the old adage says, if you are not on the table, you could possibly be in the menu. I think we may possibly have been in the menu for long. Now, we don't want to be there anymore. We want to be where the conversation is having on the next global financial system. And we want to make our contribution in terms of, and we want to make our contribution if there is any contribution to be made in terms of paying our portion of taxes that are required.
And like you rightfully said, Mr. President, investment in that space is key. Ms. Greenspan, what's your assessment of recent investments in green growth, and how can we accelerate those?
Yeah. Let me say, you remember that movie that was the good, the bad, and the ugly? We have all of that at the same time. Yeah. The good news is that investment in renewable energy is picking up. Yes, and has been growing for several years, and that is good news. The bad news is that only 2% of the total investment in renewables in the world is coming to Africa. Damilola, you are in these numbers every day, yes? So you correct me if I say something wrong. But only 2% of the total renewable energy investments in the world are coming to Africa. So it's true that there is an appetite in the private sector for renewable energy. The problem is that the investments are happening only in certain countries, and many countries are being left behind of that investment. So the question is, how do we make two things at the same time? How, like the President said, do we scale up investment, especially in the energy transition that is key for the climate change goals, especially in the developing countries, because we won't get to the targets set in Paris unless that happens in the developing world. And second is how we not only scale up that investment, but we make it happen at a sustainable cost and path for the countries. What we have done in our investment report is to show that the most effective and cost-effective way to do that is with the combination of private investment with multilateral banks and government policy intervention. If you have the three, you can get better projects and better financing cost for the projects to make it happen. So we go again to the conversation of before. What are the instruments that the multilateral development banks can put forward to leverage private investment, de-risk investment in renewable energy in our countries, and make it happen not only with debt, but also with equity and with investment in our countries, because we know that debt has also a limit to which it can get. So we need it to leverage private investment. We cannot get the scale only with multilateral development banks' money. We need the private sector to be part of the equation. And we need the policy frameworks in the countries to make it possible and to have the right models for the renewable energy investment to happen. So there are, we need loans, we need equity, and we need de-risking instruments for making it happen. Let me just refer to one point that the president said, that is, I was part of the high-level panel for the first Financing for Development conference that happened in Monterrey. And I was part of the panel that Kofi Annan put together. And in that report of the high panel, that was an advisory panel to the conference, we proposed a carbon tax already then. That was 2001. Because we know that obviously if you have the pricing of carbon right, and you have a tax on carbon, so you have a universal instrument, as you are saying, President. And you could finance the transition also with, and it has all the economic sense, yes? Because you will be paying for the externalities and the bad externalities that you are producing. It has not been possible to do this for 20 or more years that this has been in the discussion, and I think that it's time that we sit seriously. And the IMF has been, voicing the carbon tax more forcefully in the last days, but it's true that an international source of financing is a necessary, probably, instrument to be able to face the challenges that we have going forward.
You're right. She's so
go
right.
Go on, yes, Mr. President.
Yes. She's so right that it cannot happen otherwise. We just have to agree that we cannot depend on the benevolence of a few countries. This is a global challenge. It requires a global solution. Not depend on the US or Canada or France or Germany. We have to have global infrastructure that will give us global resources. Then we need to agree this time round, the way it is given out, is not given out where others are paying 6 times more than others. It is now given out. We agree on the formula for giving out. We were not there when the other formula was being agreed. So this time round, we agree on this formula together. And let me say one more thing. You see, even speaking to this aspect of risk and aspect of, debt as a percentage of GDP, what is the balance sheet we are using for countries? Have we really captured the assets of every country? On one hand, we capture the assets that have been developed using fossil fuel resources. On the other hand, we give no account of renewable energy resources that we accept that they are huge resources, but they are nowhere in any country's balance sheet. We have huge assets of carbon sequestration. When are we going to make our renewable assets part of our assessment of our wealth and make it a percentage, the money we have borrowed, a percentage of GDP? When are we going to make our renewable assets part of our balance sheet? When are we going to make our carbon sequestration assets, natural assets, our mangroves, our forests, when are we going to make it part of our assets so that when you calculate the money we have borrowed as a percentage of GDP, you don't tell us we are at 65 when we are actually at 15. It means we can open up a lot of fiscal space if we were assessed appropriately with all our assets. I mean, it's another conversation we must have. I have talked to the Africa Development Bank on this subject, and they are the ones actually who are telling me, look, I think there is a conversation we should have. And we should do this without all these geopolitical pushes here and there. We do not think, and I insist that we shouldn't be having this quarrel between the West, the South, China on the other end. I mean, we're all one of the same, part of the same equation. And it's not also going to be fair for anybody to be asked to choose friends, that you cannot talk to the West and talk to China at the same time. I mean, that would be very unfair if anybody were to require of us that, or to try and choose friends for anybody. I think we just need to be fair. Let us look at a global problem. Let us have a global solution, including everybody. China must be in the equation. Our brothers and sisters from the global south, those of us from the continent must be in the equation. Of course, our brothers from the global north must be in the equation. Let us have a conversation about how to solve this problem together. Because in any case, when it finally, I don't want to use the not so good words, when we are in this together, and everybody is going to, I didn't want to say when the shit hits the pan, because I'm told it's unpresidential. So we will all be in it together. So it's better we leverage on all our assets. What China can bring into the equation, let's get China to bring into the equation. What the West can bring into the equation, let us bring it into the equation. What we as a continent can bring into the table, our assets, our renewable assets, our green minerals, whatever it is that we can mobilize, our agricultural farms and all our human capital, whatever we can bring to the table, let us bring to the table and solve this global problem together.
Thank you, Mr. President. The final question I have for us here before we go out is, Mr. President, Ms. Greenspan, you know, we've got members of the private sector here. And, you know, in the spirit, Mr. President, of everyone working together towards, you know, a single solution, private sector can certainly not be left behind in that aspect. I will begin with you, Ms. Greenspan, and then I will come to you, Mr. President, just on the issue of access to finance for the private sector and how this can be facilitated better.
Yes, let me speak mainly about access of the small and medium-sized enterprises to finance, because they are the ones that have more difficulties, yes, to be financed, and especially when we are talking about the global value chains and being part of the global value chain, if we want an inclusive development. So we need to be able to give access to finance to the small and medium-sized enterprises to participate in the global value chains. And many times, let me say it carefully, the banking system is not really necessarily well equipped to work in the specific mechanisms that the small and medium-sized enterprises need. That's why many of the innovations in fintech and that can really help. One possibility, there are two ways in which you can, you know, give them access and include the formal banking system also in the strategy. One is that digitalization of small and medium-sized enterprises help in the access to finance. And many times that connection is not made, because when you are digitalized, then you have the accounting, you have the proof, you have the certifications that you will need to be able to access to the financial system. So the digitalization agenda of small and medium-sized enterprises is as important for access to finance as the availability of finance itself. The second is the flexibility in some of the regulatory norms that exist, because a lot of the financing many times that you need for the small and medium-sized enterprises to be part of the global value chain is working capital. We are not talking only about the capital for the investment itself, but it's the working capital that end up killing the business. And so the access to working capital as a priority has to be put very high in the agenda. And the third issue is bureaucracy. Is the bureaucratic, obstacles that you have to make it happen. When you are small in a small enterprise, to deal with the paperwork, to deal with the rules, to deal with the certifications are a problem. So the simplification of the bureaucratic side, and that are important obstacles many times to these enterprises to become formal, is also an important part of the agenda for the access to finance and the existence of the small and medium-sized enterprises.
Mr. President?
I quite share the same sentiments with her. Let me just say that this conversation we're having about finance and how to de-risk it, how to make it affordable, how to make it accessible. That conversation is not complete until you bring in the private sector. Because the private sector has great potential of a multiplier effect. But the private sector cannot go ahead, sometimes, especially in spaces that are risky. The private sector is driven by return. And therefore, they want to know what is the return, because the private sector shareholders demand from management, results. So for us to multiply what we are doing in the public sector, the private sector is very significant and very important. And that is why when we are discussing about de-risking, there is no way you can get private sector money into Africa if we haven't sorted out the issue of risk. Nobody's going to invest here. We just have to be honest to ourselves. The moment we sort out that, and they can see what the public sector is doing, the private sector can multiply that 2-3 times. It is, they can bring that on board. Now, I will give you a practical example in Kenya. We had a conversation as a country about the cost of fintech money. And it was quite something. It was quite a conversation. In fact, it was one of the big conversations in the last election. Fuliza. You guys remember. And it was because I think the fintech companies were charging 1%, I think, per day or thereabout. So it was 300% per year or something like that. So, and the big conversation was, this is predatory. That was the language then. But let me tell you the positive side of this. So when we decided, as government, when I came into office, I promised that we would look at another financial product that would be cost-effective. So we came into office, I called the fintechs together. They are business people, but they are also patriotic. I was really amazed at the patriotism of the fintech companies. They were making money with what they were doing, but they were willing to work with us on a product that would make them make less money, but more beneficial to the public. That was amazing. I mean, really. That's how positive they were. So we developed a product, the Hustler Fund. Instead of charging 1% per day, we are charging 0.002%, is 8% per year. And all the fintechs that were in that space, many of the banks that were in that space, participated in bringing into being a product that was more amenable, accessible. It was much more cheaper to the public they participated in it because they saw the value of greater access. Today, we have close to 15 million Kenyans on the Hustler Fund. We've lent 35 billion in the last 8 months, Kenyan shillings. And we have 7 million people almost daily in that space. So, and the same private sector that was participating in the predatory one, if I may call it, are participating in this one. And they are supporting it. So that tells you how the public sector can influence the private sector to do the right thing, to bring down the cost from what it was to what it is. And that is how I could explain that if, as the public sector, we were to de-risk the space around financing, we would leverage more resources from the private sector once they see what we are doing in the public sector. So my conviction is that the private sector is an important player in this equation we are having around financing and the climate change and especially financing for those of us in the global south that we feel a bit disadvantaged.
Thank you, Mr. President. And indeed, the MSME sector has been identified as a key driver towards building back better from the COVID-19 pandemic. Ms. Greenspan, Mr. President, if you allow me, I want to go out and engage the members of the private sector who are here. I am still here, I am available, and both of you can definitely weigh into the conversation that we are having here. Mr. President, I just want to carry on from that trend of providing finance. And one of the things that you have also been keen on spearheading is availability of information, for instance, the cost of credit tool. I'm looking for financiers in the room. Mr. John Gashora is here, the Group Managing Director from NCBA Bank. Perhaps, Mr. Gashora, you could speak to us about, access to information and how that has changed financial access, particularly to the small and medium enterprises in Kenya.
Thank you, Yvonne. Thank you, Your Excellency, and thank you, Secretary General. I think one thing, Your Excellency, you did not say is that on the Fuliza side, you also challenged us to revise the pricing, and I think we came through. So thank you for throwing that challenge to us and making us see what we should be doing as a multiplier to what the public sector is doing. I think to your question about total cost of credit, I want to talk about three things because they all relate to that total cost of credit. So first of all, for those who don't know, the total cost of credit is a tool that was developed between the banks and the regulator, the central bank, through which SMEs and other customers can compare pricing of every loan that they want to take from a bank. So today, you just go to a website and you look at the pricing for the product that you want to take, and all of us as banks give our information. But that really works in conjunction with something else that was developed when our able CS for Treasury was governor, which was credit information sharing program. And that was put in place so that, again, every SME, every individual can get their credit performance information being made available to other financiers. And the reason now they work is because then you can look at, given my rating, given my credit rating, what kind of pricing am I getting from each of the banks? And that's how it is working. I think the third thing I wanted to mention is that more recently, the banking sector, again, working with the regulator CBK and the government, have come up with the risk-based pricing framework. And the idea is, again, to be able to go from this is my risk rating, this is given my risk rating, this is how my bank is pricing me, and given what my bank is pricing me, this is what the market, other banks would be pricing me. So it's really giving that a lot of, putting the decision in the hands of SMEs. And I think what we have seen is that because of that, actually, we've seen very good growth in SME credit. And I know, Yvonne, you're going to ask me about that.
That's what I wanted to follow up with. Yes,
in terms of the numbers, very quickly, the most recent Monetary Policy Committee numbers say that the private credit growth stands at 12%. That is still a very healthy number considering where interest rates are. Now, when you look at that 12%, our own numbers tell us that if you deconstruct that 12% to look at SMEs alone, that number is between 18 to 20% for SMEs in terms of growth. So it's clearly working, it's growing. And the other thing I wanted to mention is something His Excellency mentioned, which is the Hustler Fund, and the work that the digital credit providers are providing. Because when we look at the numbers again, what it tells us is that whereas a lot of the borrowers may be individuals, about 50% of the money lent by the digital credit providers, whether that be Hustler Fund, whether that be Fuliza, Mshwari, and others, is that 50% of it is actually going to what we call micro SMEs. That mama mboga who needs to buy potatoes in the morning and sell by the evening. That's where it's going. So again, and that has seen, as I think the President talked about the numbers, a lot of growth. I mean, 35 billion lent since Hustler Fund came into place, and of course complemented with the other digital credit providers that we have in the market. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for that, John. And a lot of what you're saying is actually enabled by tech and AI. It's driven by that. But, you know, we also know of the vulnerabilities that exist in that space. Do we have Eva here? There you are. Eva Ngigi Sarari, for those of you who don't know, is the country manager for Kenya Visa. Eva, perhaps you could speak to us about how to find secured tech and AI-powered financial products that would sort of fund what John is talking about.
So let me start by appreciating the role that fintechs play when it comes to driving innovation in the financial services sector. At the top of it, they've been very instrumental in driving financial inclusion. Yeah, I think for us who've been around in the financial services space, we saw mobile money, again, credit to our current CS, being the first fintech licensed in our market. And that has led to financial inclusion being at 83% in Kenya, which really stands out if you look at the global metrics. But that said, over and above, the experimentation with new technology, whether it's AI, blockchain, or cloud computing, or it's also the new business models that they experiment with, which has made credit very accessible because it's not just relying on traditional data to make credit decisions. They're using behavioral data, which over and above getting more insights onto the borrower. Thin credit files are no longer a limitation. But with the advancement of technology, with more people getting onto technology, risks have also compounded. The biggest risk that we sit with is cybersecurity. And when I look at how do we, de-risk that, one, we've agreed that fintechs are very critical for the financial services space. How do we de-risk, the financial system as we bring them onto the financial system? One is partnerships. It really has to be partnership. And I think the President has really, emphasized on the point around partnership, where one party brings in the expertise, the other party brings in innovation. So for us, utilizing, for a network that processes 67,000 transactions per second, technologies like AI are extremely important. So we've seen AI evolve over time. So whether it comes to, risk scoring of the payment, whether it comes to, identifying, the various aspects of that payment to see whether it's really a clean payment, whether it's, a system that really looks at it from a threat point of view. Every system that's coming into that network is treated as a threat and screened as such. The second one is making available these technologies, right? For us who are a fintech and have been here a lot longer and have had the chance to learn and invest, making it easier for the fintechs that are coming in to adopt similar frameworks, right? So whether we are, providing mentorship, investments, strategic partnerships, that's also a model that would be successful. And then lastly is the common responsibility, through progressive policies, through, frameworks that are inclusive, right? So I wouldn't say there's a single way of doing it. There's the three I've listed. I'm sure there's much more, and that's why we're having this dialogue. So it is a pleasure to participate in this conversation.
Thank you for that, Eva. And you've talked about that financial technology, and I'm wondering if it has met its purpose, which is in terms of enabling a critical pool of resources that then helps SMEs to scale and to access the global supply chains that we're talking about. Mr. Habil Olaka maybe can speak to the issues. Is on the far end of the room, if you can catch him. There you are. From the Kenya Bankers Association, I know Eva has been talking about partnerships, and being the Chief Executive Officer of the Kenya Bankers Association, do you think financial tech has enabled SMEs to scale and access the global supply chain system?
Yeah, I think maybe I can start from the point that His Excellency the President mentioned about...
Yeah, could you just move it up a little bit? It's working. Just move it up a little bit.
Yeah.
Oh,
am I audible?
Let's help you with another one. That's better.
Yeah, maybe I can start from the point that His Excellency the President mentioned about, on the conversation about the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, and the mention of the fact that that's where our markets really lie. And I think for that to become a reality, I think there's got to be a transformation of the financial system. It has got to come up to scale. And I think one of the areas in which this can be done is by, for example, providing the short-term financing, facilitate the trade cross-border. Also the long-term financing for purposes of financing the tradable goods and services. But then also we need an effective cross-border payment system. Now, for the purposes of getting these products short-term, long-term financing, I think one of the biggest challenges has been the scale. And the local players, I think, are not having the necessary capacity to be able to come up to scale and support the cross-border trading that is so much the objective of the Continental Free Trade Area. Now, one of the ways, we have got the players like, for example, the Pan-African regional institutions, the regional bodies, and I'm talking about the Africa Development Bank, I'm talking about Afrexim Bank, who can actually partner or get into arrangements with the domestic institutions that are playing on the continental space to be able to structure financial products that can be able to meet that gap. Now, when you talk about, for instance, the developing the payment system across cross-border payment system, I think one of the critical things is the fact that we need this cross-border payment system to be efficient and effective. And for this to be achieved, a number of things will need to be put in place. For instance, the banking system will have to be aligned across. We have got to develop the necessary policies that will actually be able to support minimization of the transaction costs. And then something critical is the fact that we'll have to get some consensus on the settlement currencies to be used across the cross-border payment systems, because that's a critical element. Whenever there is transactions across different currencies, there is always the exchange loss that becomes a major issue. And of course, across payment systems, there'll usually be disputes. So we need to have a dispute resolution mechanism to be able to resolve all that. But I think I will not have responded to the question if I do not address the issue of the MSMEs. I think MSMEs, and Madam Secretary General referred to it, indicated some challenges that they do face. And I think I would like just to add one more to that, in the sense that I think most of them would need to come to the table in terms of facilitating or taking advantage of this Africa Continental Free Trade Area. And actually, they should be the ones who are being fronted as the major beneficiaries and being able to support the cross-border trade. Now, for them to be enabled, I think one of the things that we need to do is capacity building, and then provide the incentives. On the topic about capacity building, at least at the KBA, we have taken some little steps. We have got a program which we call Inuka Enterprise Development Program, whose main purpose and objective is to provide capacity to the SMEs to be able to access financial services from the formal institutions. Most of them are actually informal. Taking them through that journey of converting them from informality to formality is what Inuka Enterprise Development Program is all about. And I think that now needs to be scaled up. What we are doing is just a fraction of what needs to be, and I think it needs to be scaled up. And if it can be scaled up and similar programs coming up, I think we'll have the SMEs coming up to the table and playing their due role.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Olaka. Ms. Greenspan, Mr. President, I know you both had a very long day. Allow me to just indulge one more, because I think it's important for us to talk about, the production of raw materials, value addition, and the exportation of the same. Ms. Mbathi, who's the Chief Executive Officer of Two Rivers International Finance and Innovation Center. Ms. Mbathi, perhaps you could speak to us about the role of special economic zones in turning around the dynamic from exporting of raw materials, to, or rather importing finished products towards now exporting them out of Kenya and the continent.
Thank you, Yvonne. Good evening, Your Excellency. Good evening, Madam Greensberg. So special economic zones can offer a very conducive environment for investors. And indeed, these are special ecosystems that are created through government support. And they allow for simplified custom procedures, tax exemptions, streamlined regulations, and improved infrastructure and access to utilities. We heard you, Mr. President, when you say, but what are the real opportunities? And what do we have here in Kenya and indeed across the continent? We have a skilled workforce. And indeed, we know when leaders are looking at special economic zones, they're looking at jobs, jobs, and jobs. What can we do? And indeed, we have the vibrant financial infrastructure. And Madam, you mentioned it in terms of actually interacting with M-Pesa, and indeed Mr. Kashora mentioned it in terms of the other banking products. So SEZs can facilitate the development of local industries and value chains by creating those linkages with domestic suppliers. And indeed, during COVID, we saw how important it is to create our own value chains. We can also provide training and skills and development for workers, and we see that through our different partners, and we appreciate it. But indeed, internally, we are also able as countries to foster innovation and technology transfer. We've heard that from Visa as well. SEZs enhance our competitiveness as a country and as a region. It allows us to diversify our exports by enabling access to regional and global markets. And indeed, sir, we've seen that when we look at the apparel industry here in Kenya, and indeed our exports through AGOA to the US. So reducing trade barriers, costs, and promoting quality standards and certification is very important. But I can't sit next to you without talking about sustainable development goals and how we incorporate environmental standards and social safeguards. This is also very important. And green technology. There we really have that opportunity, as mentioned by Your Excellency, renewable energy sources, very important, how we treat waste management, our labor rights, and indeed gender equality. Very happy today to be part of many ladies in the room. And basically these special economic zones, which is indeed a partnership, as you said, Your Excellency, government, private sector, multilateral, all of us coming together to expand markets, to attract investments, and indeed to foster those value chains. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ms. Mbathi. And now, to close, ladies and gentlemen, I thank you all for coming. We could speak about this for hours because there's much to talk about, and the opportunities exist, in various sectors of the private sector in Kenya and in Africa. But I'm afraid we have to close it there for now. But I'd like to give final words. First, I'll begin with you, Madam Secretary General.
Can I give the floor just to the President, because I don't have anything more
Certainly.
to add. I have learned so much from your intervention. So on the opposite, I would
Certainly.
give
Your Excellency.
the President the...
Okay. Let me commend our technology, visa, and all the people in that space. Innovation, creativity is part of our equation, and they've really been useful, especially in the MSME space. They've given the MSMEs an opportunity that otherwise they wouldn't have. I think technology has become a real enabler in that space. I agree with Mr. Gashora that they've really been partners. When we agreed that we need to relook at our numbers, especially in the space of credit in the fintech space, they were patriotic, if I may say, and they took down their numbers, took less profit, and I think that was really patriotic. And of course, we all agreed that we need to do more in the space of developing an alternative collateral system. That it's not necessarily that you need a collateral of one type, a title or a logbook or whatever. We agree that we need to develop the credit rating space as an alternative collateral for access to credit, and I'm very happy with what we are doing with them. Finally, the point that has been mentioned by Mr. Olaka from the Kenya Bank Association, in terms of this whole integration ecosystem needs the backing of financial instruments and financial mechanisms. And I am a great believer in what AfriExim is proposing as a payment settlement system, where we can all trade in our local currencies, and then we get somebody to do the settlement. And this is not against anybody. This is not against the dollars, against the yuan, against the rupees, or whatever. We're just saying we spend about $5 billion. That's what it costs us from one currency to another. We can save that money by making sure that we have a payment settlement system that takes into account which dollars are supposed to be going this way, which euros are supposed to be going that way, which yuan is supposed to be going this way, and then we provide a settlement system that makes sure that takes care of our trade, makes it much more easy, and removes the trouble of traders and business people and entrepreneurs and investors chasing dollars when they need them, euros when they need them, and all the other currencies when they need them. We provide a settlement system, and that is a Pan-African system. And we're very clear as the government of Kenya. Professor Ndungu here has been providing leadership in that space, and we've, I think, even offered to be the headquarters of that particular facility in the continent, because we believe we can provide some expertise. We have sufficient technology infrastructure to provide that expertise. We have sufficient financial understanding to be able to provide that service. And so we believe that that is the direction AfriExim should go, and that's how we should make it much more easy for integration, for trade, for business to move goods and services from across borders without necessarily having to imagine in which currency they have to pay. So I think that that's a very welcome development. Allow me to give Moses, you've been doing a lot of work in that space. Do you want to say something, or do you think I have said everything I would really? And maybe I'll give another 1 minute to Waziri.
Thank you, Excellency.
Njuguna.
Me saying something does not mean that you have not said it. You have actually said it. But let me just say 2 points. One is on the whole space of Africa integration and AFCFTA. This afternoon, I was having a discussion with a gentleman from UNCTAD, James, about something very important that we are doing today, that is launching the report on diversification of global supply chain. And he told me that the drivers for this diversification is, one, the geopolitical issues that we're having around COVID, around Ukraine and the war. And of course, the green transition, and the third one being technology. And I told him, James, there's a fourth one which is missing. And why it is missing is because we've not been part of, we have been on the menu, as His Excellency has said. The whole thing of opportunity. Today, if we diversify our supply chain, and Kenya is leading that with our industrial spaces, with our export zones, with our special economic zone, it's not just to diversify supply chain for the North, but actually the biggest incentive for us is the opportunity. The opportunity that within our markets, our regional markets, our continental markets, even before we become a supplier to other regions, we are going to supply that to ourselves. And so the issue of the payments, Pan-African payment architecture that is suitable for Africa becomes very, very, very important. In my previous life, I was a member of parliament. And when I look at this whole discussion on the fairness in climate issues and finance, I sometimes think we should have passed a law. I should have passed a law to say, if you pollute your own air. Yeah? Then the other person can pollute their own air. But unfortunately, it's not possible. Because the environment, we share all of us. And His Excellency is talking about the whole thing of the fossils and the contribution from those people. Perhaps, and I've challenged him many times because he's our voice in this continent on this issue, maybe we should consider coming up with something called OGEC. I like to call it OGEC. Because you have got OPEC for the petroleum people. Shouldn't you have OGEC for the green? So that you can have organization of the green exporting countries. So that costing, the balance sheet issues that His Excellency is talking about, can have a voice so that as they meet in Vienna to talk about the fossils, maybe we can be meeting in Nairobi to say this is a cost and this is a valuation of our green assets. Finally, let me touch on the whole issue of pricing. And I'm speaking now as a former banker. Your Excellency, I was having a conversation with the World Bank last week, and they sent me to you. And they said, ask the President to be a little bit magnanimous and generous, and not fall into the temptation of being selfish. And I asked them why. They said, by our own definition, the best credit score in the Republic of Kenya is a credit score that has been generated by the Hustler Fund. I said, can you ask the President to see, is there any way the credit scores coming from the Hustler Fund can be used universally by everybody, including banks? Because, for me, this was a little bit surprising, because World Bank, with its many years of experience working even with you guys in the financial institutions, did admit that the true credit score for the Republic of Kenya is on something that is barely 6 months old. And that, to me, is a serious indictment of the way we price risk, both domestically, and maybe if you could be generous and allow World Bank and these banks to use the credit scores coming from the Hustler Fund, maybe we need to give it to the international financial architecture. Maybe you're asking for a solution and we have the solution. Thank you, Excellency.
Thank you.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary.
I will invite you to the climate summit. You can propose. Those are some of the ideas we want to bring on the table. Thank you very much. Professor Ndungu, do you want to say something finally from?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Your Excellency. And mine, I think, Madam Greenspan, mine is maybe to add the note with the development infrastructure. This is we can talk about the other side of financial system, but we have to talk about the physical infrastructure, which becomes very, very important. And that infrastructure lowers transactions cost for private firms, for small firms, for MSMEs. And once because they're transactions heavy, so the infrastructure is very, very important. And because you have lowered their transactions cost, you actually enhance their profitability. And that is where the momentum of growth comes from. Now, the biggest problem, that is where we started, that's where Your Excellency you started, how do we finance that public investment? And that is where you find ourselves going for debt. And you can imagine, for example, the kind of thing that has made Kenya being downgraded every time is actually the feeling of you have about $20 billion to be paid in 2024 by African countries which have Eurobond. But the coupon for Kenya is actually $2 billion, which is heavy. And there is a doubt, is Kenya going to pay? And that's why our ratings keeps on. But the bottom line is this. The bottom line is, can you borrow at 6.57% to provide public good, that is public infrastructure? And for that reason, for 10 years, it's not going to be possible. And that is why we find ourselves in that trap. But more importantly, nobody told us that, yes, it is going to be trading in the market, but the risk profile will change its price. So in a sense, we are having a double hit. Right now, ours is trading at about 11.5% from 6.5%. It had hit almost 20%. So you can see the whole issue of being trapped in the debt is not because debt was consumed. Debt was actually put in public investment, but those public investments were required. But obviously, the pricing is becoming very problematic, and that is what my colleague here consistently said. We have to have the capacity to analyze and price risk. And that is how we are going to improve the financial market. So we can combine the financial market, what is happening in the financial market, and public infrastructure. And you can see the constraint that we are facing in the development discourse is actually tied to that, just that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor. Now you see the difference between when a professor speaks and when the rest of us speak.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Mr. President, thank you very much for your time. We really do appreciate you being part of this important conversation. Madam Greenspan as well. Your Excellency, Asante Sana, you may take your seats.
Thank you.